All right, this is actually a fake title, but I will remind you to engage. The real title, so I like to play with titles, and writing titles is really hard. Conferences always want titles really early, and I never know what I want to call my talks until the last minute. So, this book that I'm almost done with is still untitled. This talk was untitled until fairly recently, but the current working title is The Elements of Scaling. So we're going to talk about scaling. We're going to talk about scaling teams. We're going to talk about scaling companies. We might even talk a little bit about technical scaling, if you're lucky. So how do we scale? Well, some people have, written things to talk about scaling, and what they say is that the way to scale is to hire a bunch of these 10x developers. Have you heard of this? The 10x developer. They're like these magical unicorn creatures that somehow, by virtue of their brilliance, just work 10 times faster than other engineers. And so if you hire one of them, it's like you're hiring 10 people. And therefore, you can build a whole company of these magical 10xers, right? And therefore, you don't have to hire that many people, and your scaling problems are super easy. And also, they write beautiful code, which means that, oh gosh, what's knocking? Sorry, which means that you don't have to worry about refactoring, rewriting their beautiful code, and it will scale to your user demand too. 10x developers, magical, wonderful. Well, unfortunately, also not really a thing. So instead, we must deal with humans. Now, insofar as 10x developers maybe are really a thing, they are probably a thing because they're in great environments that help them be productive, that help them be effective, right? This is the effective delivery track. And I think that what all of us are trying to do when we think of effective delivery is we're trying to think about how can we make the people on our teams better? How can we make them work faster? How can we make them more effective, right? More efficient. And that really means that what we're talking about is kind of team building, which is kind of like management. So I'm going to talk a little bit about management today, not just about management. This is a talk for everyone. If you are not a manager, don't worry. There is a lot of content in here for you. But to give you a feeling of management, I have a couple of quotes to start us off. The first is by someone named Casey Stengel. The key to being a good manager is keeping the people who hate you away from those who are still undecided. So there's one idea of management. Another one by Dwight Eisenhower. You do not lead by hitting people over the head. That's assault, not leadership. And I wish I had heard that one earlier in my career, but okay, so about me. So as was said in my introduction, I am an engineer. I consider myself to be still an engineer. I still do things. I actually work on a couple of open source projects you might have heard of. I'm part of the Apache Zookeeper group, committers, and program management committee. I also am part of the, I'm sorry, this mic is just having issues here. I'm also part of the Drop Wizard web framework. If you've never heard of that, it's a little bit like Spring Boot, only I think it came out before Spring Boot. It's a nice, lightweight Java web framework. So I like to think of myself as still being technical, still being an engineer. But yes, I'm also a manager. And how did I get there? Well, I started out working as an engineer and becoming a tech lead, as many of you probably have done. Right, it's a very common path. I managed small teams as a tech lead for a long time, working for a really big company, in this case, Goldman Sachs. You may have heard of it. A little investment bank. It's been in the news a lot. So I worked for Goldman Sachs for many years, and I had a great time there. I eventually sort of graduated into one of those lovely senior individual contributor roles. You know, the ones where you get to be kind of smart and design big systems, and it's awesome, and you don't have to worry too much about humans, except that at a big company, you always are worrying about humans a little bit. You're worrying about all those humans you have to convince that you actually are smart in order to, get them to use your projects. So I was at Goldman Sachs trying to convince these smart humans to use my projects, in this case, a big Zookeeper discovery service for the Goldman Sachs service-oriented architecture, which they probably have rebranded as microservices, I'm not sure, but that's what we all did at some point a few years ago. So I was doing that, and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed writing code and designing these big systems, but at some point I was like, I think that I want to do more. I want to have a bigger impact. It's very frustrating not having a team that I'm leading myself. It's very frustrating to have to ask other people to give me people to work with me, right, so that we can actually get bigger things done. And I have a feeling that if I had a team working for me, if I was actually in a management role, I could get a lot more done. So I did what a lot of people do, especially 5 years ago, a lot of people did this, which was I said, I'll go work for a startup. Because startups are where you go when you're at a big company and you want more power, right? No, okay. Hopefully not. Hopefully not. That's a bad joke. I really don't mean that seriously. But I did go to a startup. I went to a little company called Rent the Runway. What is Rent the Runway? Rent the Runway is a company in the States that rents women's designer dresses and accessories, such as this lovely dress that I'm wearing today. I went to Rent the Runway as a director of infrastructure engineering. So I was the director of infrastructure engineering. I was not the CTO. I was not a VP of engineering. I was not the co-founder, right? I was managing a team, but I was writing a bunch of code. I actually went to Rent the Runway because I thought it was a great business and because they needed a lot of help technically. They were in a bad situation technically. They had this old Drupal PHP framework that they were using to run this rental website. Unfortunately, that was not a good match, right? It's not a great thing to try to hammer in a bunch of bespoke logic into Drupal. One of my former teammates described Drupal a little bit as an amazing mold. You can pour concrete into it and get out an apartment building. But if you want to replace the sinks in the apartment building, you are chiseling through concrete to do it. It's very difficult, right? It's not very modular. So we were doing a big rewrite, and I led this rewrite out of this Drupal PHP framework into Java-based, quote-unquote, microservices. And it was great. So I joined Rent the Runway. And to give you a sense of what I'm like as a hands-on manager, because I was managing, yes, but I was writing a lot of code, this is what I'm like as a hands-on manager, right? If you don't test your commits, I will bury you. I'm very particular, let's say, in the way that I believe good quality software is created. And I try to teach people how to do that, but sometimes I can teach it by being kind of a hard ass, right? So it's all going well. We're doing this rewrite. Everything's going on. It's stressful. It's a startup, right? Things are not perfect, but it's okay. And then what happens? Oh, well. We have what I have decided to call a cultural segfault. So as I said, I was hired in as a director of engineering. I was hired in by someone, there was a VP of engineering at the time, who had hired many of the people on the team. And he ended up leaving the company. And there was really no one to replace him. I was the most senior person on the team who had been with the company the longest, and this is about 9 months into my time there. So what did I do? Well, I said, hey, I'm at a startup, and I came here because I wanted to learn and grow and stretch myself. So, hey, boss, hey, CEO, why don't you put me in? Let me run the team. I can totally do it. It's no problem, right? Running a whole team is like no big deal. I can do that. It's just a startup. I know how to do code. I'm good at that. I'm charming, right? Sort of. It'll be no big deal, right? And so she realized that for the time they had no better option and let me be the interim head of technology. And I eventually went from interim head of technology into VP, SVP of engineering, into CTO over the next 3 years. However, not without some bumps. So my very first review, 4 months into this job as interim head, I'm sure that the CEO told me good things. I'm sure she had some good feedback. But I will never forget this review for being one of the hardest reviews I've ever received, because the negative feedback I got from this review was that I was creating a culture of fear. Yeah, right? Like, oh, that's really not a thing you want to hear in a review. That is not at all a thing you want to hear in a review. It's kind of terrifying to hear something like that. You're like, oh, especially when it's unexpected, and it was unexpected. I did not realize that my team was afraid of me, that they were afraid of making mistakes in front of me, that they were afraid of what I would do if they screwed up. I knew that I was harsh, but I had come from finance where yelling at people is okay, and apparently that's not the case everywhere. So this was a wake-up call for me, right? This was a huge wake-up call, like, wow, you know what? The dysfunctions on this team might be coming from inside the house. They might be coming from me, in fact, right? So I spent the next 3 years from that wake-up call until the time that I left Rent the Runway a little bit, around a year ago, building what I believed was a culture of trust. So moving our team out of this culture of fear and into a culture of trust. And this talk is about some of the things that I did and learned along the way doing that, that I believe are applicable to everyone, right? Not just those of you who are in management positions, although if you are a manager, please pay attention. There's a lot of stuff here for you. But frankly, even if you're an individual contributor, even if you are a new individual contributor, you are contributing to the culture of your team, right? Your actions, your behaviors, the way you treat other people, and you are interacting with other people, unless you are truly a solo operator working off on the side on your own stuff, in which case I don't know why you're here, because most of the challenges of effective delivery are really more about teams than about individuals. But if you are on a team, if you're a member of a team, there are a lot of things that you can do to help that team be better, even if you're not leading it. Why is this talk called The Elements of Scaling? Well, oh my God, I'm sorry. Scaling systems and scaling teams have a lot of similarities and challenges, right? Scaling systems, let's talk about scaling systems for a minute. I'm a distributed systems person, so I'll try not to go too far down that rabbit hole. But when I talk about distributed systems, I talk about the challenges of distributed systems being really challenges of communication largely, right? It's all about communication over the network. And one of the big challenges is actually also about coordination. The more you have to coordinate, the slower these systems go because of the challenges of dealing with the network. That's a fundamental truth of distributed systems. If you are a distributed systems engineer, I'm sure you know this. Teams are very similar, right? You want to add people to your team. You want to grow your team. Effective scaling is about having every person that comes in be as effective as the first people were, right? Not losing effectiveness when you add people. Or even better, letting fewer people be able to do more, right? Those are the goals of scaling. But to do that well, especially if you're actually adding more people, requires you to think a lot about the overhead of coordination. And in particular, if you don't have trust, you're going to have to do a lot more communication and coordinate a lot more because you don't trust one another. Trust allows you to kind of get rid of a bunch of the coordination that's necessary to make good teams work. Because trusting teams just work better together. They know more when to communicate. They communicate in better ways. All right, anyway, so let's move on. Let's really get to the meat of this talk. The first thing that I learned was all about speed. And this is the most straightforward section of this talk. This is the easiest to understand. Hopefully everyone here is fully bought in on the concept of help your teams move faster by helping them deploy more frequently. Basics, continuous deployment. We actually didn't do continuous delivery, but we did move from when I got there maybe once every few weeks deploying to once a week to once a day. And this is a pretty essential element of making your teams work better. So let me tell you about getting there. When we did this big move, this big rewrite to microservices, right? We also rewrote the front end to be this Ruby layer, right? So this Ruby layer that was serving the website, serving, all the content, serving all the assets. Well, as with most rewrites, we did some things well, we did some things poorly. You don't even need to read what's in the boxes here, but as you can see from a diagram like this, this is kind of complicated. This was all the complex interdependencies that we somehow made the website serving layer of our code do after all this rewrite. We just basically over-engineered it. We were trying to do this fault-tolerant swim lanes thing, and we ended up with kind of a big ball of mud with a bunch of Git submodules, and it was a mess. It was a mess, and it took a long time to deploy. So we were deploying this once a week, but it was taking a few hours. Now, we were missing automation, but we also had a lot of complexities with how do you actually join all these assets together. Again, these were all supposedly separate things, sometimes deployed into different environments. So we said, okay, this can't stand, right? Nobody liked this. The engineers, the managers, nobody was happy with this. So we sent a team away and said, okay, let's make deployments faster. And so they simplified the Git, they started to work on things, it was great. They put some automation in place, and then towards the end of that process, I said, hey, let's go further. Instead of just being able to deploy faster, let's deploy every day. Now, going from faster deployments to the ability to deploy every day is not just a matter of saying, oh, okay, cool, now we deploy every day. You have to do some more work. You have to teach the team how to break their code down into smaller chunks. You have to add things like feature flagging. But we did it. We did that work. It was not as hard as I might have feared. And we started deploying every day. And the impact to that was immediate, positive, massively successful change in our culture. So, turns out engineers like to ship, especially engineers at startups. Engineers at startups want to be deploying code. Your team, probably everyone in this room, you want to be able to say that you have the opportunity to do what you do best at work every day, right? And if you are a software engineer and that's what you do, you probably want to say, I want to be focused every day on writing code or designing systems. I don't want to be spending days and days dealing with broken releases, dealing with the release process, right? So just letting people get through that hump was an immediate benefit. But even more than that, the frequent releases, the frequent easy releases, removed these bottlenecks of coordination that we had. Because when you're only releasing once a week, your releases become a bottleneck. The release becomes this scarce resource. And we all know what happens, right? You're getting ready to cut the branch for your release, and someone says, oh, can I just have 15 more minutes to get this change in? Please, just 15 more minutes. My product manager is breathing down my throat. So you say, fine. 45 minutes later, they're done. They've broken the build. So now you wait, give them another 15, 20 minutes to fix the tests, and sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't, and then you have to roll back and start the testing process again, and it's a nightmare, and 3 hours later, you've finally done the release that you started 4 hours before that, right? And you just feel annoyed and frustrated, and this is every week after week after week after week. That's because your releases are so scarce that it's a contended resource. Once you free up that resource from being a contended resource, all of a sudden, people feel more autonomous. They feel like they're able to kind of work independently. They can get their stuff done when they're ready to get it done. There's no product manager breathing down your throat because if you don't get it done this week, your next chance isn't for another week. I promised that I would give you all something to take away. Here's number one thing. Whatever your role is, be impatient. Be impatient on behalf of your team. When you detect things like, why do our releases take 4 hours to do? If you can use that impatience and channel it into solutions, channel it into a desire to make those releases faster, to make that process faster, you will make your whole team better. Okay, so the next element is structure. Okay, maybe not structure, because a lot of people really have a bad kind of attitude about structure, kind of understandably, right? We've all experienced some kinds of bureaucracies that are really unpleasant, right? And startup people in particular, I actually read something where they surveyed some startup folks, and they were like, what do you think when you think of the word structure? And they were like, slow, unnecessary, innovation crushing was one that I heard, which is like, ooh, that's really bad. All right, but so let's not talk about structure, let's talk about learning and transparency, because really, structure is kind of inevitable. If I were to give you 50,000 lines of spaghetti code and say, make it so that a team can work on this code, what would you do? Well, you might refactor it somehow. You might add tests, you might add documentation, you might rewrite it in another language. You would do something to add structure to that code. Because structure is what helps us get to the essence of what needs to be done more quickly, right? Structure is that stuff that lets us bake an apple pie with some pie filling and a pie crust instead of inventing the universe to do it. So, structure is not good, it's not bad, it's simply something that comes to be to make us more effective. In particular, I think that the best structure comes when it comes out of transparency, right, when it comes transparently, so you understand why that structure is in place, and it comes out of learning. It comes out of learning really from failure. I would bet that most structures you interact with, even the ones that you hate, are kind of a reaction to something. They're a reaction to something failed, and somebody said, oh, let's try to prevent that failure. And so they maybe put some process in place, they put some structure in place to learn from that failure and to try to correct course. Because structures fail, right? This is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. It's a famous structural failure in the United States. And, you know, this bridge stood for about 40 days, something like that. and it failed due to wind shear. And there's like video of it, so it's very cool. It's very famous for that reason. Now, structures fail, and we've all experienced structural failure. But we don't just say, hey, you know what? This bridge failed, so we shouldn't build a bridge there. That's a bad place for a bridge. No, of course not. They weren't going to just make people kayak across that river. They instead said, okay, let's learn from this failure. Let's encode those learnings into, oh God, I just said learnings, sorry. Let's encode those lessons into the next bridge that we build, right? Let's build a better bridge and learn from our mistakes. So I have a famous, quote unquote famous structure that I created that you may have seen or maybe not. It's called the Rent the Runway Engineering Career Ladders. So if you're not familiar with this, engineering career ladders are like the job descriptions by level for engineers, right? So engineer 1, engineer 2, senior engineer, staff engineer, things like that, right? That shows you the things that are expected at every job level, as well as for managers, right? So engineering manager, engineering director, et cetera, et cetera. And Rent the Runway actually open sourced ours. We put ours online so that anybody could use them, take them, copy them, modify them, and a lot of people apparently have. I've heard from people all over the world who have used this as a starting point, which is awesome. Those ladders, I'm very proud of them. I'm very proud of the work that the team and I did together to create those. But they came from failure. The first failure being that we didn't have ladders at all. We were just kind of a team with people with random titles. Senior iOS engineer, right? Systems engineer, junior web developer. That didn't really correspond to anything. They weren't correlated together. They were just kind of random depending on when you got recruited, and pay was kind of random. Like it wasn't all over the place, but it was a little bit all over the place. So that was a failure, and we knew we needed to fix it. So I created the very first version of our engineering ladders, and it looks something like this. Very, very basic. The D&D characteristics are awesome. I can't take credit for that. I actually stole that from a different team's ladders. But I kept their format, actually, which was super basic, very little information. And I gave it to the team, and I put people in levels, and I said, here you go. Here's the levels. Here's the ladder. Go forth, and whatever. Now, it was good that we did this exercise, because now we kind of knew what levels people were at, and we could recruit for things. But this was still a failure. It was still a failure because in trying to make something basic, I wanted people to not obsess about their levels and not obsess about this whole career ladder thing. But instead, I made it very ambiguous, which actually made people obsess a lot more, right? They didn't have a role in the creation of this document, and they were really afraid. This is the kind of structural failure that we've all experienced and we probably all remember. So we went back and we created something better. And this is a snippet from the existing one. I'm not going to leave it on the screen because there's way too much text on there. You can Google it and find them online. The point is that I went away and took a bunch of the other people on the team, and we together created something that was a lot more transparent, that was a lot more well understood, that was created not just by me off in a corner somewhere, but by me and the other senior members of the team. And then I used inspiration from external people, and then I gave it back out to everyone in the world so that they would have a good starting point when they decided to do this for their own startup teams. So the lesson here is that, yes, my structures have all started from points of failure, and they've all gone through these points of failure. But what I have found is over and over and over again, as I've interrogated these failures, I've created something better by being transparent about them, by learning from them, and by encoding those lessons into the structures. Which brings us to what you can do. So the learning review. How many people are familiar with this term, learning review? Okay, very few of you. It is a rebranding of the term blameless postmortem, which I hope more of you are familiar with. Right? What is a blameless postmortem? Something goes wrong, and instead of, pointing fingers and saying, Bridget screwed up. Bridget fat-fingered that command. She doesn't know what she's doing. We shouldn't let her, have root access on the boxes anymore. That will solve our problem. You say, well, why do we have anyone with root access, right? Why was Bridget forced to fix this at 3 o'clock in the morning? Why did this thing go wrong in the first place? What are all the different factors and causes? And try to do it in a way that's not blaming someone, right? Because there's usually not really a single person to blame. There's usually a lot of little things that combine to create these failures. Learning reviews, blameless postmortems, are an amazing opportunity for you to interrogate structure and learn from it and make it better, right? So interrogate structure whenever you see failure, and try to ask yourself, how can we make this a little bit better? One final note that I'll leave you on, though. Processes tend to fail when they tell people exactly how to do something, right? Checklists have their place in this world. But if you find yourself relying on creating processes that are very, very explicit sets of steps that a human must follow in order to do something, see if you can't automate that. Because humans are not really very good at following very precise steps. You may have found, I certainly have. Processes are best when they help you understand what needs to be done, not necessarily exactly pinpoint how to do it. All right, so effective delivery. What the heck does relatedness have to do with effective delivery? Right? You might sort of buy structure, maybe. Relatedness. What is relatedness? Relatedness is feeling like you belong. It's feeling like you're a member of a family, like you're a member of a team, like the people that you're working with care about you as a human being, you care about them as a human being. Doesn't mean you're best friends, doesn't mean, you feel like they're family, but it makes you feel comfortable and related to them. When I was an individual contributor, I was really good at sacrificing developing relatedness for efficiency and focus. So I was one of those people who would come to work and work for 4 hours and be very focused. I would go to the gym. I don't want you to talk to me at the gym because gym is not for socializing. And then come back, eat lunch at my desk, be focused for another 4 hours and go home. I didn't do a lot of coffees. I didn't do a lot of lunches. I did occasionally do drinks after work, right? I was an individual contributor. I was working with 5 other people regularly. I got to know them through the course of doing work, but I really didn't understand why all these more senior people, especially the managers, did all this small talk stuff. They asked me about how I was, and I was like, why do you care about that stuff? It's not work. I want to talk about work. I'm interested in work. Let's focus. Well, I learned my lesson. Remember, I created a culture of fear, and that was one of the reasons that I did it, because I didn't really spend a lot of time getting to know people. But if you want to create a really effective team culture, people need to feel like they can be vulnerable in front of one another. So this diagram that you're looking at, the picture on the right is from Google. Google did all this study. They have so many teams, so many people, and they're very data-driven. So they did this study that they've been talking about a lot recently about what made their most effective teams. Now, we'll assume that they're interviewing incredibly well. Whether or not you buy Google's interview style, they certainly are interviewing very thoroughly. But their best teams had nothing to do with whether the people on them were the most awesome engineers or not. The number one fundamental effort was whether or not the members of those teams felt psychological safety around one another, whether they felt safe to make mistakes, to ask questions, and to fail around one another. That was the key. That was the key of gelling that team into absolute effectiveness. Are there other elements? Yes, but that baseline psychological safety was essential. Right? If you look on the pyramid there, the pyramid is the 5 dysfunctions of a team, with the baseline dysfunction being absence of trust. When you don't feel vulnerability, you often don't trust the people around you. And this is not the trust that your peers can write code well, right? This is not the trust in just basic abilities. This is actually the trust in intentions, the trust that they are trying to do what they think is best. When you don't have relatedness, you don't have vulnerability, you don't have trust. And all of these erode the ability for teams to effectively work and deliver together. To correct this, start by learning how to apologize, especially if you are in any kind of leadership position, and that includes those of you who are simply senior engineers. Somebody's looking up to you, and you're going to make mistakes sometimes. And when you make a mistake, it is okay to simply apologize. Say, I'm sorry, and move on. You don't have to have an elaborate apology. You don't have to, defend yourself. Just apologize. Because the thing is that when you don't apologize, especially in a leadership position, when you make a mistake and you don't apologize or admit it, people start to internalize that. They start to say, ooh, well, Camille made a mistake, but she didn't apologize. She kind of just ignored the issue and swept it aside. That must mean that it's shameful to make mistakes. That must mean that mistakes are bad, that we don't admit mistakes. We only care about appearing strong, right? Strong and resilient, and I never make a mistake, and I must be perfect. And that is terrible for effective teams. You want people to feel capable of making mistakes, right? Especially in a startup environment, you're trying to push your teams a little bit past their breaking point sometimes. You want them to push themselves. You want them to take risks. Some of those risks are not going to pay off. That's okay. But if you want them to take risks, they need to be safe, feel safe failing, which means they need to be able to fail and apologize for it and move on. One place that you can all practice this relatedness beyond apologizing is when you're doing your interviews. Interviewing is kind of a drag, especially if you're in a team that's growing really fast and you're having to interview a lot and it interrupts your coding time and all you want to be doing is just like, I want to be thinking about this problem and you're distracting me and it's super frustrating. And sometimes we take it out on the people that we're interviewing. In fact, often we take it out on the people that we're interviewing. I'm sure many of you have had that experience. I've had it plenty of times where someone has been interviewing me and it's clear that they are just like, I'm a waste of their time. And I've probably given people that same experience. Practice developing just a little bit of relatedness at the beginning of your interview. Ask the person how their day is going. Offer them a little chance to go to the bathroom, get a drink of water. Just take a little bit of time to say, hey, how's your day going? Like, how was your night? How are you feeling? Something innocuous, something that just shows that you care about them a little bit as a person, that you're interested in getting to know them a little bit as a person, right? Because you never know, this person that you're interviewing, even when you're in a bad mood, may end up being on your team. And now you feel a little bit more of a connection with them. And when you're interviewing, probably what you want to do is not just figure out, do they match these skills or not? The best interviews, you're trying to get someone to their edge of their skills. You want to figure out where is the edge of their skills, which means you want them to make mistakes in front of you. You want them to fail in front of you so that you can discuss those failures. And they are more likely to do that if they feel comfortable around you. Again, relatedness. Relatedness is also important because it helps us foster healthy conflict. You might think that I would say we shouldn't have conflict. A lot of teams, especially in the United States, I believe there's like a huge fear of conflict that's happening these days where people just really are afraid to say, that they disagree with something. They feel like it's just, there's no room for that. But conflict is good. I think conflict is actually a pretty healthy thing. When you have a disagreement with someone, when you and someone else disagree, and you disagree sort of, this isn't like a moral disagreement, right? You're having an intellectual disagreement. The conflict is what helps you get all that data, all that information into the open. You want to understand, I'm a smart person, they're a smart person, we disagree on an approach. Why do we disagree? Let's get the data that each of us knows into the open so that we can evaluate it more thoroughly. That being said, this is a photo of me with my going away gift from my team at Rent the Runway. It is a very heavy fitness hammer. Do they have CrossFit here in Denmark? Maybe a little bit. I could see the Danes being kind of into it. So this is a picture of me with a very heavy fitness hammer, sort of popularized by CrossFit-esque exercise. And my nickname at work was the Hammer. My nickname at work is a hammer, partly because I am really cool with conflict. I'm comfortable getting in there and expressing my opinions very firmly. Well, as you can imagine, as a leader, that's also not really a great thing. When your boss comes in and forcefully slams the table and says, you're wrong, you're not listening to me, this is what I said, this is where we're going, done. Very, very, very occasionally that might be the right thing to do, but probably not. It just makes you shut down. It makes you not want to share information. That also shuts down that flow of information, which is the whole purpose of conflict. So, too much conflict is not great either. In both cases, whether you are conflict averse or like me, conflict, grabbing, replace that conflict with curiosity. Just try to replace that desire to argue or that fear of argument with a desire to ask questions and be curious about why someone has a different perspective than you, right? Most people, when you ask with genuine curiosity, not fake curiosity, not the, oh, really, you don't know that? I just can't believe you don't know that. Not fake curiosity, real curiosity, right? Real, honest curiosity. They open up, right? People are happy to share, and they can tell when you are being honest and open and asking them questions. Which leads us to our very, very, very final point, right? You want curiosity because you want to have a workplace where you go into those meetings and you have really effective communication and you don't have a lot of boring meetings. There are a lot of workplaces with boring meetings, right? Either because they have too many meetings or potentially because the meetings that they have are far too scripted. I'm not a fan of highly scripted meetings most of the time, because I think that you actually can shut people down, right? And that's not necessarily the best way to run these kinds of conversations. Meetings should not consist of a group of people who have little to say until after the meeting, right? That's a sign of a boring meeting. Meetings are our highest bandwidth communication opportunity as a team. Whether you're in the same room or you're on a call because you're remote or whatever, the goal of having meetings is that focused, high bandwidth communication. Remember what I said, scaling is hard because communication and coordination are hard. Well, if communication and coordination are hard, why would you want to waste your precious high bandwidth communication opportunities? Don't. But if you have a bunch of boring meetings, you're definitely wasting them, right? You want healthy conflict so that you can have meetings where people can actually express their opinions and you can discuss real issues. So to summarize, move fast, right? Engineers like to ship. If you aren't moving fast, if you're reluctant to move fast, just get over it. I really encourage you. You will be so much happier and your team will be so much happier if you just constantly focus on helping people do their job faster and better, right? Structure, neither good nor bad. Be transparent about it and interrogate structure when you have failures and improve it. Practice being related with your colleagues. Practice relating to people as humans. You don't have to be their best friends. You don't have to go to the bars with them all the time. But, asking questions. How's your day? How's your dog? How's that marathon you ran? Whatever, right? Asking questions about their lives and getting to know them as humans will make you care about them. Will make them care about you and will make your team more effective. And don't settle for an environment where you can't ask questions, where you can't get into it, where you can't have active discussions, where most of your discussions are passive discussions rather than active discussions. If we are willing to stand fully in our own shoes and never give up on ourselves, then we will be able to put ourselves in the shoes of others and never give up on them. That is a quote from a woman named Pema Chodron, and I think it's important because at the end of the day, what I learned in growing as a leader and in growing from this culture of fear to this culture of trust is that I had to open up myself. I had to open up. I had to become more vulnerable. I had to question things that I had assumed had to be the way they were. And once I started doing that, all of a sudden, things got easier and my team got better. And I really learned that empathy is a learnable skill. Believe it or not, when I started asking people how their lives were just a little bit, I started caring about them more. And they started caring about me more. And I, turned into someone who was less cold and standoffish and more, demanding but inspiring, right? And what's the point in scaling a team? What's the point in scaling a team? What's the point in scaling a company if you end up working with people that you hate? And with that, we are done. Here are some of the resources that I referred to. As Dan said, I am writing a book. If you are interested in that, please stay tuned early next year out of O'Reilly. And I am happy to take any questions or comments, and otherwise, I'll let you all go. Thank you.
So we have a couple of questions. One I suspect is quite fast. The other one is a bit chunky. I really like this. I've heard 10x developers referred to as technical debt loan sharks. What do you feel about this statement?
So 10x developers as technical debt loan sharks?
Loan sharks.
Wow, that's a good one.
They're lending you technical debt at a hugely inflated.
Here's what I think, right? I think that it's very hard for people, especially if you have worked your whole career at stable to large companies, to appreciate that you need those loan sharks when you are in a very early stage company, and that there are people who are just amazingly good at spinning out new code when there's a total greenfield environment. It's bad. It's often, usually even, bad code, but they're really good at doing it. The thing is that they're not 10x developers. They're just really productive early stage startup developers. And you're right, they are producing code that is probably not going to stand the test of time. But when you are in a startup, you don't know if your company is going to stand the test of time. The code is less important than the company, and it is extremely rare that the code is what makes the company not stand the test of time. Unfortunately for all of us who come into these companies when they're a little bit more stable and they need bailing out, and you have to deal with all this loan sharky debt code. Yeah, that is unfortunate. That's an unfortunate situation, but I kind of want to balance it to be mindful that there is a time and a place for producing that kind of work, and that is why we always say 10x developers, if they exist, are really a function of a culture and an environment. The right environment for them is what makes them so productive. But yeah, I don't know. Anyway, long story short, there's a time and a place for all that technical debt. You're lucky to survive your first 2 years as a startup, but yes, you probably don't want that person spinning out reams and reams and reams of code in your stable, large team environment, because they'll just drive everyone crazy.
Fantastic, thanks. I have one other question that I suspect might be a whole other talk, which is, how do you build up a distributed team?
How do you build up a distributed team? I am not an expert in that. I think that Bridget, there might be a talk tomorrow by Bridget at the end of the day, towards the end of the day, talking about distributed teams. Distributed teams are hard, and you kind of have to, I think the best practices out there today are, if you want to do a distributed team, you really need to, from the beginning, be thinking about how to effectively be distributed, right? A lot of companies I know that have effective distributed teams, even when there are people who work in the same office together, they do all of their meetings on video chat, even with the people who are in the same office, right? To force that concept of nobody is assumed to be in the same place at the same time. But that is a whole nother talk. Hopefully Bridget will touch on some of those points tomorrow. And I'm not really an expert in it either. Anyway.
I'm seeing lots of nodding from Bridget, so whoever asked that question, you've come to the right conference, but it's on the wrong day. So, we've got another couple of minutes, so does anyone have any questions? And I can run around with this microphone. Hand shot up over there, so let's go there.
Thanks. Hey, you were talking about how we need to build a culture that failure is good. You have to learn from the failure. People should not be afraid of it. But at the same time, you said that you should apologize if mistakes happen. How do you reconcile these two? If you start saying, I'm sorry, it's like the mistake is something wrong, right?
Well, I think it depends on the kind of thing that you're apologizing for, right? So, there are times when you have set up to fail, when you're we're running an experiment that might fail, right? You're not going to apologize for a failed experiment. Oh, well, that sucks. Move on. But in most environments where you want people to take risks, sometimes what they're going to do is they're going to move before asking, right? And sometimes in moving before asking, they're going to screw up something that is not a good thing, right? That does deserve an apology. Ooh, I should not have deleted all of that code and pushed to prod without talking to the person who wrote it, because I thought that I was, just getting this thing done, and I really didn't understand the context that I was working in. And ooh, okay, I'm sorry, right? I'm sorry, I screwed up. Yes, I took a risk, right? And I'm in a company where we are encouraging people to take risks, but sometimes those risks do come with sort of the human and team cost, and they deserve an apology. When you take a risk that you either know or don't know, but ultimately ends up having a human or team cost, that is when you apologize, right? When you take a risk that is just an experiment, that's kind of we know we're going to run experiments, and sometimes they'll succeed, and sometimes they'll fail, you don't need to apologize for that.
So I have another question that's come in on the app. So I'm sure this is asking for a friend, but when you're in an organization managed by fear, where do you start to change it? Asking for a friend.
Yeah, when you're in an organization managed by fear, where do you start to change it? I mean, so my experience and from what I've seen from other people, the biggest thing about organizations managed by fear is that they they often have just like certain behaviors that you kind of have to stop. So yelling, as I mentioned, right? Yelling, not awesome. Berating people, blaming, that sort of whole like series of interrelated behaviors is definitely a huge contributor to culture of fear. And getting rid of those is important. And you know, part of that really means that the senior-most people, especially if they're the ones who are yelling, need to learn how to stop doing it. If they're the ones who are yelling or blaming or criticizing publicly, they need to take it down. If they're not the ones that are doing it, but there are other people on the team who are letting behave that way, then it's the job of the managers to pull people aside and say, hey, you know what, that's not cool. We need, you know, we want you to be respectful of your peers here. We want you to be respectful of the other people on the team. And I know that we've let this go for a long time, but we need you to stop. Right? That, I think, is that sort of just basic behavioral, right? Read about blameless postmortems and start doing that if you're not. If failure is treated with a lot of blaming, blameless postmortems actually can be a really great practice to just add to just, you know, just to get rid of that habit as a team.
Fantastic. I think we can take one more question.
One more.
One more question.
Yeah? Yeah?
Oh, I'm going to go to the middle there. Why did I make it this hard?
Thank you. Okay, so maybe I missed the point of it, but the defined titles, the exact purpose of that, what was that? Was it the exercise?
Oh, you mean for the engineering career ladder?
Yeah.
So the purpose of it, and this, you know, I don't know how cultural this is, right? It may not apply nearly as much to those of you who live here in Denmark. In the States, at least. So the purpose of it is a few things. First is helping people understand what the progression through certain levels of recognized success is in a company. So, you know, when am I a senior engineer? How do I know what that looks like? What are the things that I need to have accomplished, that I need to have shown ongoing strengths in order to get from a person straight out of college, straight out of school, to becoming a senior engineer, right? That's you know, that is not determined by numbers of years on the job. That's not determined by any one simple metric. It's actually determined by a set of, you know, accomplishments and attributes that you have gained as an engineer over time. So in the States, these levels, you know, we use them for hiring. So we say, hey, I want to hire someone, and I need to hire someone who's at least a senior engineer, for example, into this position, because that's kind of the level of independence that I need. I need to hire an engineering director. It's helpful as a manager and as a leader to help people understand what areas they might need to work on. So when you're writing reviews, coaching people, saying, hey, like, you're awesome, you're a great engineer, but you're kind of a jerk to people, and that's holding you back, and it's very clearly laid out in the sort of communication and leadership column. It's also frankly, for paying people. Most companies in the States, pay is tied to some extent to what layer you are, to what level you are, rather. And it helps actually, like, be explicit about, like, look, if you are a senior engineer, a staff engineer, if you are a really senior person on a team, there is something to be said for someone who has really proven and shown that they have the experience necessary to make good decisions, for rewarding and recognizing that, right? And that's not to say that that person should shout down more junior people to them, but I do think that we lose something when we when we pretend like everyone's the same and we're all at the same level, because that's just not true in most teams, especially not large teams. So those are some of the reasons that we did it and that we use it.
Cool. And with that, we're out of time. So thanks very much, Camille.
Thank you.
Wonderful.